Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the PHRN seminar series. It's nice to be back after a little bit of a break. We had our research day back in November, and we're happy to be kicking off this year's seminars with our dear friend Mike McMorris. I'll just do a bit of a background on Mike, and then I'll hand over the reins to him. Mike grew up on a beef farm near Guelph, Ontario. He completed his Bachelor's of Science and Master's at the University of Guelph. Later. Mike worked for MAFRA for a number of years following his education. He worked for a number of other organizations, including the Ontario Cattlemen's Association, AgriCorp, and Bio. Last fall, Mike has started as the CEO of the Livestock Research Innovation Corporation here as well. We're absolutely thrilled to have Mike here with us today, talking about what livestock's going to be like in 2030.
Thank you. And just advancing slides, what am I using?
You can use keyboards or the mouse.
Okay.
Or the enter button.
Great. So I'm already wired up for the camera, which sounds good. Can you hear me at the back, Dave? Okay. In that case, I'm not going to double wire. I'll feel a little constricted. So thanks for the invitation. Maybe just to help me understand the audience, put your hand up, please, if you're faculty. Great, thank you. Students? Yeah, okay, it's the free pizza. Now I know. Okay, I'm a realist. It comes with age. So I really like this kind of talk because basically it gives me an opportunity to come and just share some thoughts. I told Steve before it started, it's not like I'm going to say, this is the new product X and here are any scientific measures around it. It's more going to be observational and looking ahead to 2030. So I don't normally include this slide, but this talk's going to wander a bit. So I thought I've got to give you a little bit of context of where my thought pattern went on it. And I think it does tie together at the end. So a little bit about LRIC. So put your hand up if you know really well what LRIC is. Good. I needed to include these slides. A bit about who I am, because we think based on where we've been and what we've experienced. So I'll give you a bit of context of why I'm thinking the way I do. A few thoughts on, so what do I think 2030 livestock will look like? Okay. I will throw some maybe not so bold predictions up, and you can debate or decide if you agree. And then just some thoughts or advice. My hope is that I do say some things that cause some discussion after the hour. Not that it's that controversial, but just maybe to get some discussion going on some of the things that I've said. So just on LRIC, a Livestock Research Innovation Corporation. It's a small not-for-profit that was formed in 2012. We have a variety of members. You can see the founding members at the top, so the major organizations, very much supported by the Ministry of Agriculture and Food as well. We also have a number of smaller organization members as well. Our focus is livestock research and innovation. It's relatively broad, but I want to recognize Jean, throw your hand up. If you look at the two of us, you're looking at the entire staff complement of LRIC. So we have to temper our ideas to implementation because it's one of those wonderful things where, while there's no bureaucracy, any idea you have kind of falls to one of the two of us to actually do something about. So you can learn more if you're interested by going to livestockresearch.ca. It's a fairly simple, straightforward web page. It gives you background and information on who we are and what we do. One of the key things that we do is we offer complete end-to-end research management system or service to our members. That goes from helping them set priorities through to managing a call, to evaluating proposals, getting contracts in place, and making sure reports are finalized. Some good examples of that, Beef Farmers of Ontario just had a call for expressions of interest, closed a couple of months ago. They ran that through our system. Before that, we facilitated a day with their research committee to come up with their list of priorities that would feed into that call. They have now a call out for full proposals on a number of those. The current alliance call, or our University of Guelph OMAFRA agreement, we're involved in getting additional industry review of those proposals, and I review all of the livestock proposals as well. So I'm getting to know Steve and some others in a new capacity as we review those proposals. On our website, if you want to know where's the Ontario industry fill in the blank for sector, what are they thinking their research needs are? By and large, these are relatively current. Some we've had a lot of involvement in. We've just, about 3 weeks ago, completed an update on the goat strategy, so the new version will be going up there. We just did the beef strategy about 6 weeks ago. Ontario Forage Council had a session in October. That's not up there yet, but generally speaking, that's a good spot to go to find out what the research priorities are sector by sector. One of the other roles we play before this slide is that we then take those and try to put them together and give the ministry an indication of, okay, across all of livestock in Ontario, what are the priorities? One of the other things that we do, so we have a board of directors of 9, comprised of our founding members plus some appointments that try to bring special skills and experience to our board. They then choose an emerging issues committee, and over the years, so I was on the LRIC board for 3 years and I was on the emerging issues committee. I find that stuff really interesting. So what's out there, what's coming at us? I've been at a commodity organization, and the commodity organization tends to be focused maybe a year out, but they're usually fighting some sort of fire that's within the next 6 months or shorter. So one of the roles we try to play is to look out a little further than that, say 3 years, maybe 5, what's coming at us. And so over the last 5 years, gut health and cellular agriculture and plant-based products were identified. That might sound today like, well, so what? But 5 years ago, those were emerging things. And frankly, 5 years ago, if you had some discussion within the livestock industry of cell-based protein or plant-based is going to be a real challenge, you would not get a lot of attention. It was something that we actually had to bring forward and promote the fact that it did require some attention. Ontario is really lucky, I think, as far as research in livestock. We're about halfway through a pretty big transformation of all of the research facilities. So dairy, done about 3 years ago, beef done but not done because there are other barns that have to be built, so it's still 3 years before fully completion. Pork commitments underway, planning is beginning, and poultry's on a bit of a pause, but it's coming down the road. So we've got really good facilities. There's also a sheep facility. The role that we tend to play, before 2012 with LRIC not there were some disconnects happening. One of the key roles we play is trying to make sure things are connected and that ideas are getting to the right people and that things keep moving. One of the other things that we do is communicate with our members and more broadly. We use a number of ways of doing that. So we have a monthly newsletter called Livestock Innovation. Send either me or Jean an email if you would like to get on that. Out of curiosity, hand up please if you get that newsletter. Good, excellent. It's also the sort of thing that all of our members get, and they routinely forward it to their board of directors or advisory counselors, so it does tend to get some wider spread. Research Scout is an email on a somewhat regular basis where we dig out some interesting, more scientific article-based things and send those out. We do a quarterly member report, and one of the things I want to add into that is an update from the research facilities. So when I hear producer groups saying, that's a great facility, but I don't know what goes on there, that causes me concern because they need to know what's going on and support it so that the next time they have research funding that's obvious for them, that's where they want to go. We also have contract written several industry articles you've probably seen. The writers here, Lillian Scher. So as much as Jean and I are the staff, Lillian's a really important part of helping us to get our message out. It may not surprise you that if you looked at her and I, she's the one that runs our Twitter account. So I just kind of feed her information and we try to get information out that way. Steve Miller used to be a professor here, and he had a slide that he and I rip off each other's slides with permission routinely. And he had one, this just the top part, that research is turning dollars into knowledge and innovation is turning knowledge into dollars. And when he switched from the university and then gave a presentation, he said, I now do the second one and it's harder, which I thought was a really interesting observation of somebody who's done both. And I think that's fairly true. So brand new dairy facility, research going on there. And I've misused it a bit because I use the dairy barn for those who are really astute and a beef farmer, but it doesn't matter. A research facility to a farm somewhere in Ontario to a person who's going to make a decision and a change on their farm. That's a long arrow with a lot of pieces in between. And I'm not sure that part works really well. That's a lot of the innovation side of things. That's the hard work. It's in our name, Livestock Research and Innovation Corporation. It's something we want to be more involved in. We are involved with a professor at Guelph out of Harold Chowdhury, and he's got a KTT program funded project to start to look at what's in that red arrow and what is working well and what isn't, and are there ways that we can make those pieces come together to better effect. The other thing that just started, and it's one of the more exciting parts of my job, to be honest, is that I think one of the things, and it comes from my experience with the Canadian Cattlemen's Association mentorship program, getting new faculty really well connected to industry is really important. So talking with the two deans of the two colleges, I pitched that idea and they seemed to like it. So we kind of put it out there and we've got 4 people who have signed up for that, which I think is fantastic. I mean, it's going to be incredibly flexible and it'll be tailored to what they need, but I'm really excited to see that getting such interest. So a little bit more about me so you understand my background. I did grow up on a beef farm. If you've been to the beef research station, which is probably all of you, and you're facing this way to the beef research station, start walking and walk to the back when you hit the next road. So everybody can visualize that. Look across the road and you're looking at where I grew up. So it's pretty easy for this audience to know exactly where I grew up. University of Guelph grad, real interest in animal breeding and genetics. Worked in OMAF doing beef extension, so I was a piece of that red arrow in my first job, trying to kind of the tail end, working directly with farmers, and then a variety of management jobs for about 13 years. I then went to the Ontario Cattlemen's Association, now Beef Farmers of Ontario. I was general manager there, and so I've certainly got the context of how commodity organizations think and the range of focus that they're dealing with. I then went to Director of Operations at Agricor. So Agricor is a Crown corporation that delivers crop insurance, agri-stability, those sorts of programs. I then moved to Beef Improvement Ontario, which was focused on beef genetics, but it morphed over the 11 years to be data capture across species, and the board then renamed it Ag Sites. And the last 3 years I was a director at LRIC, and then the last 4 months I've been the general manager. If I had to say one quote that is like my favorite, is this one. The best way to know the future is to create it. The other thing I really believe is that as people, we don't understand history well enough because there's a lot to learn from history, not to be shackled by it, but we tend to just keep driving forward and not learning from some of the things that we've could have learned from in the past. And I think that's probably a bit more of a North American thing than some parts of the world. So, put your hand up if you don't recognize that building. Good. That's Johnson Hall in 1915. Check the car right about here. All those nice big trees that are on Johnson Green, they're not even planted yet. That seems like so long ago, right? 1915 is not that long ago. One of our problems, I think, is that we discount all that stuff that happened more than about 10 years ago. And it is a function of getting older that you start to appreciate old things more, but also you appreciate history a little more and perspective. So that's actually a picture, part of a long picture that's over my mantle that I inherited when one of the ag offices was closed. And I thought, if nobody wants that, that's heading to my place. Well, what does that look like in farming techniques? That's 2 generations ago. That's also a picture in my house. And that's obviously thrashing in Leuven, Saskatchewan, which town's not even there anymore. It's near Weyburn. If you don't know where that is, it's southeast of Regina. That's an awful big change in 2 generations. So when you put it in context of generations, it doesn't sound quite as long ago. But everything changes. So I've tried to circle dates so that you can kind of see where I'm pulling things from on the dates. This was very recent. One of the largest dairy companies in the US started in 1856. So the oldest picture I had, this is much older than that. And that company just went bankrupt. Lots of reasons why, and just the point there is that as part of history, things do come and go. I tend to read a lot of books, so I'm going to be quoting about 4 books here. Some of you have already been pushed by me to read some of these. The Age of Discovery is one I'm not quite done yet, but it's a really interesting read, and I see somebody grabbing a pen. My understanding is that anybody wants these slides to save themselves writing down stuff, you can have them. The author of this book picks a very specific time period in history, was known as the Renaissance. I don't know enough about history to know much about the Renaissance, but it was 1450 to 1550. And he's arguing that in that 100-year period, there were things happening that were unique pretty much to the history of mankind. And his position is that from 1990 forwards to an undefined end date, we're kind of in a second Renaissance. And when you read the book, it's actually quite fascinating that if we really understood that period, we could have predicted and maybe avoided some things that we're struggling with currently. So like the printing press was developed, the understanding of the universe. So, hey, the earth goes around the sun, not the other way around. That was in that time period. And you know what? Nobody cared for 200 years. It seems odd in today's context that a major discovery is ignored for 200 years. I think we're doing it today. One of his points is that while people were really focused on a whole bunch of things, there were great big things happening that people weren't paying attention to. Again, I think that applies to today. He also makes the point that in a period of change, such as that 100 years and we're in now, there is a far greater reward and risk available to individuals and to all of us. Another book, this is one of the best books I've read in the last 20 years. Thomas Friedman is a writer with the New York Times. My wife jokes and says this and another book I should actually get commissioned for because I've pushed on a lot of people. The title's odd. It's called Thank You for Being Late. The title comes from somebody was late for a lunch with him and they came and said, "I'm sorry I'm late." And he said, "Actually, thanks, because I don't remember the last time I had 15 minutes just to think." In the book, the key, and I'm very visual, so what really got me was this graphic. This graphic was created for Thomas Friedman by the head of R&D at Google. That title alone suggests to me, I'd love to have lunch with that guy, because what kind of person is the head of R&D at Google? He did a whiteboard and he drew change over time and he put up this exponential rate of change. So he referred to Moore's law, genomics, but a long list of all these things that are undergoing exponential change all around us. He then said, we can adapt as individuals and as society and as countries. We can adapt, but not exponentially. So yeah, there's a slight rise in our adaptation over time. And then he said, you're there. We're all there. All of us. And then he goes from there into, and what does that mean? And the rest of the book, from what I remember of it, is basically, and it means this, and it means this, and it means this. So some of the things that it means, you have this kind of ridiculous craving for the good old days, because the good old days today are tomorrow's good old days. I mean, we tend to make the history look better than it was. We default to a simple answer, and I guarantee you, if you think about it, everybody in this room has experienced it. If you've ever been, the example I'll use is at a producer meeting, And say it's a veal meeting and somebody asks a question of Dave about something to do with veal, and he says, well, so here's the background of the issue, and here are the parameters around that, and so under this situation. And somebody in the crowd yells out something, a 2-word answer. The crowd immediately goes there. And that's because in a world where everything's changing around us and we can't keep up, we crave simplicity. And I'm utterly convinced that as I watch some politics playing out in the world that make no sense to my brain, that people are actually prepared to default to simple, even when they know it's a lie, but they're more prepared to default to that simple answer. That's a really important thing to know when we're trying to do research and trying to get messages out to people, that how are they receiving this information. People get frozen into inaction. I mean, you can see that around us. Some people just freeze up. They just don't know what to do because they can't keep up with the change. Again, his point, echoed by Age of Discovery, sometimes we focus on these little things. We just miss these great big transformational things that are happening. He also makes a very solid point that ministries, and I would question universities, can't keep up to the change. So think of some of the classic example is genomics. The world can't keep up with what regulations should we have around genomics? We've never had to deal with something that's moving that fast. So regulations don't keep up, bureaucracies don't keep up, and that causes lots of problems. So jumping a little bit into, okay, so what are other people saying is going to happen? So I just started looking around. Food and Agriculture Organization, this was a 2003 forecast, but I thought it was interesting, they actually forecast to 2030. So the top is the world, the next section developing countries, the next section industrial countries. The two things that jumped out at me are, no surprise, the bigger change will be in developing countries. 3 things, I guess. The second is, this is a poultry crowd, so wow, look at the poultry numbers. That may or may not surprise you. But then if you look a little deeper into the numbers, the column on the right, I calculated by number of animals times carcass weight. A lot of the change is coming via carcass weight, not numbers of animals. So that was 03 prediction. These are statistics up to 2014 for Canada. Probably no surprise here. It echoes the prediction that poultry is growing rather dramatically. In Canada, beef and pork have both seen not maybe the more flat line that would suggest, or small growth, but actual decline. I then found this. This was from March 2019, projected U.S. red meat and poultry production. The pattern is really similar. So I think from a poultry standpoint, you can expect a whole lot more poultry in the world in the coming years. So I also looked at, well, what are other people saying? Because I'm just bringing some thoughts. So Farm Credit Canada, their chief economist, had this out, last week, the 6th, saying top economic trends for 1 year. That doesn't mean they don't stay over time, but here are the 3 big things that they're saying. Not surprising, I don't think. Automation, protectionism, and climate change. None of that surprised me. So I thought, well, I'm going to put out there 3 things that I think will determine what agriculture looks like in 2030. And my context is that things are going to happen fast. I would not have quantum computing on as one of the top 3 if I didn't think things were going to happen fast. And to be honest, of the 3 I'm going to speak to, this is the one that I feel utterly clueless about. I just know enough to know that, wow, something big's coming, but I don't really know what this is. And even the tiny bit of reading I've done would suggest that those working in this know that this is going to tell us something. We don't really know what, but we'll be able to find out what we don't know and what questions we need to be asking a lot faster. So what intrigued me was the scale of this and its currentness. So that was, I didn't put the date on, January 8th. So again, very recent. IBM doubles again its quantum computing power. The part I found interesting was it talks about exascale, which some of you may be very familiar with. I wasn't. Bottom line, your current laptop in a second can do what would take you 4,000 years. A quantum computer, for you to keep up, what it can do in a second would take 31 billion years. So it's just that the scope of this thing is huge. So some of the things that it could do in the article I read was, well, we lose a lot of electricity along transmission lines. Could quantum computing help us to find out how not to lose that power? That has really big implications on the cost of electricity and greenhouse gas emissions. Molecule joining to create drugs. This one boggles my brain, but if you, in a quantum computer, piece together molecules and then predict an efficiency of that drug, honestly, if that makes sense to anybody, talk to me afterwards if you can explain it to me. But that's what is being claimed it could potentially do. What I found really interesting in reviewing the livestock proposals to the Alliance funding, and I may be making a slight stretch here, so Steve can correct me if he thinks I am, but I saw 2 or 3 of those that to me are starting to nudge into that blue circle. Just nudge. But that's animal agriculture, livestock agriculture at the University of Guelph, starting to nudge into that area. The next of the 3, genomics. Frankly, to me, genomics is still early days. When I went to Then Bio in 2008, I thought we will have genomically enhanced genetic evaluations for crossbred beef animals within 3 years. I was really wrong. As the geneticist there, Gord, some of you know, Gord Vandervoort, says, yeah, the more we know about genomics, the more we really realize we don't know yet. Like it is pretty early days. And that's very dependent on sector as well. The dairy industry is definitely making use of genomics. The beef sector, The sheep sector, should we start? Like, this is going to cost a lot of money. We're not that big. How do we do this? Beware of bacterial DNA. So that's an article that some of you will be familiar with, where a genetically edited line of beef cattle naturally to be hornless was, deal set to go to Brazil. And my understanding is the FDA did a final test and went, hey, wait a minute. In your CRISPR process, you left behind some bacteria DNA. That's a transgenic animal. Dead. Yeah, well, probably the animal and the initiative. People sometimes don't like when I make this analogy, but I do it with lots of things. I think genomics today is like nuclear energy of 50 years ago. It has phenomenal opportunity, and it has phenomenal number of questions, and frankly, potential misuse. So everybody knows we're currently sitting within 150 kilometers of 2 nuclear generation stations. Everybody knows that? Has that crossed anybody's mind in the last half hour? Did it cross your mind in the last week? And yet, is there anybody here that could give a presentation on nuclear energy who really knows it enough to give an introductory talk on nuclear energy? No? But we're all comfortable that we're within 150 kilometers of 2 of them. Why? Because somehow we have an innate trust of the nuclear energy system. It can be broken pretty quick or questioned pretty quick. It intrigues me, how did we get this trust of nuclear energy? And what can we learn from that when we're trying to make genomics understandable and gain trust around genomics? The Gene. Put your hand up, please, if you have read that book. The ones I kind of suggested it to. Okay, if you read no other book, read that one. I told my kids who are in their late 20s, early 30s, you have to read this book. They're my kids, they ignored me. They need to read that book because there's a lot of discussion that needs to happen around, so what are we doing with genomics? And we have a lot of people with lots of voices and lots of opinions, and most of them, in my opinion, are really uninformed. This is a really, really good book, Mankind's Understanding of Genetics from 5,000 years ago to today, and he looks a little bit into the future. That was a 2016, I think, book, and it really begs some of the questions. So under what conditions is genetic modification, genetic enhancement, biological enhancement, when's it okay? If you've got a child with a life-threatening disease and a genomic process can give them a healthy, regular life, I don't think there's anybody who would say, well, that's not okay. And then there's over here, and there's everything in the middle. So it's going to be fascinating to see in a system where our regulations can't keep up now, and that keeps transforming faster and faster, who makes those decisions? So, I know Cheyenne knows the answer. Michelle, when will there be genetically modified humans on Earth? What's your prediction?
I guess it depends if it's an ethical question or a can we do it question.
Nope, can we do it? When will there be? Forget the ethics and everything else. 30 years? Who put your hand up if you agree that it's at least 30 years? It's okay, you gave it away. They're already here. And the guy's in jail that did it. Like, that's how fast things are happening in this field. There were two, and some of you may know this better than me, but I know there were two sessions at which researchers said, we need to slow this down because society's not keeping up to us. There was basically we should not do viable human embryo research in genomics. And then it was announced that, well, this guy in China did. So there are 3 genetically modified humans. 2 of them are twins, Lulu and Nana. They're about 1.5 years old. They were in the news about 2-3 months ago when they were about 1 year of age. 2 parents, I couldn't understand it, but I read more. 2 parents, one of whom has HIV, and they didn't want the child to be susceptible to that, so they were genetically modified, so they were resistant to the HIV virus. The 3rd one, I don't know anything about. They're here. So 3 years ago, when I was telling my kids, you need to read the gene because you need to understand it, because it's not me, you're going to be part of this discussion of where this thing's going. This book came out. It's written by a professor at Dalhousie. It's good. It's a little dry, but basically it's a book that says what I was telling my kids. You need to get involved in this and understand it. And if you're have no interest in genetics as a scientist, it doesn't matter. You're part of society, and this is a society discussion. This isn't just a science discussion. Again, very current, January 12th, an article about gene editing, and it could revolutionize the agriculture and food industry, but will it? It's a big open-ended question. And I believe it was that article dealt with they actually had a name for it, the Monsanto attempt a number of years ago, and how bad that came through. It's an interesting article to read. So this is New York Times Magazine, January 8th. Anybody read this? It's worth a read. I admit my ignorance in this field. Strong interest, a bit of ignorance though. So I'd heard of gene drives before. I didn't realize I was actually leaving the CRISPR gene in the organism so that it then just kept driving the change in subsequent generations. Fascinating stuff. I think it's a really well-written article. 2 key points. And again, there's a consistency here, but what does a good future look like, and who gets to decide? Big, big question that has no ready answers at this point. And then this is to do with mosquitoes. So mosquitoes that can't carry malaria. Who makes that decision? Is it us in North America, or is it countries where malaria exists? Is it one country? What if one country wants it and one doesn't? Well, then this becomes relevant. How do you regulate it? It's an insect that's flying around, and you can't tell by looking at it which is which. So huge, huge questions. So with those huge potential benefits come some absolutely, at this point, unanswerable questions. So the 3rd one, it's a little bit of a cop-out, but I really mean it. Politics. And by politics, I want to define the word. I'm talking big P, small p, decision-making in society, that kind of thing. Does anybody know who Ernest Drury was? Nope. He's a former premier of Ontario. So 1914 to 1919, so around the time Johnson Hall looked like I showed a picture of, and just before my generation, 2 generations back, was thrashing in Saskatchewan. He was the premier of Ontario, and he was with the UFO party. Ever heard of that? Any guesses? Anyone? United Farmers of Ontario. I saw this book about 10 years ago and I just about fell off my chair. I thought, are you kidding? United Farmers of Ontario was a political party that actually got into power in Ontario about 100 years ago. So when we think of agriculture's context today and less than 2% involved in primary production, it's fascinating to me that we've changed that radically in about 100 years. So I want to talk a little bit about leadership in some subsequent slides. So leadership to me is not just leadership of commodity organizations or the university, which is important. It gets at the heart of political structures in the world. Has anybody been following the news around Russia in the last couple of days? I don't fully understand that, but quite frankly, my gut is screaming yellow caution flags. And that's not the only place that's happening in the world. So supply management, political decision about do we have that, do we not? I want to talk a bit about consumer expectations. It's a point that I don't really have a slide on, but I worry that the cost of transparency is bureaucracy. And honestly, when I see some of the bureaucracy that happens in some organizations, it's almost a surprise that we get anything done. I won't name organizations. You know all too well some of them. Climate change, it's big. I'm not belittling climate change. It's just that, quite frankly, I think we know, and it's going to be political decisions, not individuals, that determine, okay, what impact will that have in 2030? And then I want to talk about Piranha Bulls. So, Thomas Friedman, second time you've heard of him. He wrote Thank You for Being Late. He also wrote The World is Flat. Some of you may have read that book. It was about globalization and impacts of globalization. In his article, When the Cat's Away, he made the point, so this is talking international politics at this point, we tend to, but we cannot take democracy for granted because things can change like that and you don't even know it. Hence, they pay attention to the big things because if you don't, it might tip and you've just lost something you didn't know was at threat. He talks about an international trend towards strong men. Think of some global leaders. Anybody think of some strong men that are out there in the world today? And that is a trend. And then he had a line in his article that paused me to actually stop, reread it, think for a minute, and then keep reading. And it was, would you stand in front of a tank to defend democracy as you know it today? And that made me think about my old school definition of democracy that I didn't think about enough and where we are today. And to be honest, I had a bit of a struggle being as enthusiastic as I was 15 years ago. That tells me, which I already knew, I think our overall politics not only have some issues with them, but with the right change could be far, far better. Switching to consumers. This is a bit dated. It's about 18 months old. Canadian Centre for Food Integrity. So strongly agree or unsure that Canadian meat is derived from humanely treated animals. Who wants to take a shot at throw out 2 numbers? Anybody? You?
30 and 70.
30 and 70, 30.
Strongly agree.
Wow. You're good. That shocked me because it's a pretty high level, almost innocuous, are animals treated humanely on Canadian farms? 61% unsure. I guess that's an opportunity, although how do you then get people in their busy lives to want to know what is important to you? So, evolution of sustainable. In my last job, I was somewhat involved in how this has played out in the beef industry. Fascinating to me that it's been a about a 6-year journey to have sustainable beef in Canada. One of the early measures of success was that everybody got in a room together. Wow, that's where things started from, but it was a very necessary step so that people who normally would think, well, you're my foe, sat around a table, had lunch together. Like it was at that level. Over the last, I guess it's probably almost a year now that the pilot's done, but it's ongoing. If you were on Verified Beef Plus, which meant some basic record keeping and an audit on your farm, and your calves went to a feedlot that had the same and a packing plant that had the same, then the two producers each got somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 to $20 per head as a bonus for sustainable beef. The interesting part to me is that this was driven by not the end user, but close to the end user, McDonald's, Loblaws, groups like that. It had some success. I don't want to downplay it, but it did not have the numbers that I think are needed. And I worry because that came in our mail a bit less than a year ago. Today we're sourcing a portion sustainably, and in the future, every burger served at McDonald's. That's pretty public. If they live up to that, this is not really hard connection of dots. If they live up to that and they can't get it from Canada, then we support the Canadian beef industry, one of those has to give. And I would put my money on this one sticking. It's not just them. Sorry, last one on McDonald's. I saw this and I thought that's an interesting thing. Scale for good. I'd never heard that phrase before, but here's a company that has a very wide network, very broad public image and recognition saying, we have a scale that we can drive good. And so not only sustainable, but they're into making policy statements about reducing the overall use of antibiotics. No surprise, and it's going to happen anyway. But the fact that you've got a fast food chain that's international making statements like that is interesting. It's not just them. Costco, December 2018, so it's a little more dated, setting standards around antibiotic use in agriculture. On the Ag Sites Board of Directors is the McDonald's Canadian Manager of Sustainability. And he made the point to me one day, there was a real wake-up call to me. He said, it's not our customers that really drive change, it's the shareholders. Blinding glimpse of the obvious. I think that's something that all of agriculture has to pay attention to. You really, really need to start to understand shareholders of companies. Anybody here read The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell? A good book, really good book because it starts to get at how you need to pay attention to things because they can turn like that. So when I'm ashamed to admit it, but when I grew up, drunk driving was like normal. Maybe not normal, but it really wasn't frowned upon like it is today. Everybody smoked. Like, this room would have been blue in the 60s. Everybody smoked. Those things have turned. And again, no understanding history. For those of you under, I'll pick a number, 30, you're going to, what? Like, what world did you live in? But that was the norm. I've got a really big overriding concern that is starting to become darker on the slide. And I think at the highest level, keeping it simple, that's what we need to push back and say, no, livestock is not bad. Lots of detail around that, lots of science around that, but that's the simplest message possible. Just for a hoot, I Googled Livestock 2030. I was a little horrified at what came up as the first thing. I have no idea who that group is. I did not explore it because I don't care, I guess. But I thought, wow, there are people who trust the internet more than I do who might Google that and say, oh, wow, here's the number one source on what 2030 will look like for agriculture. Climate change, I have to address it. My concern with climate change is that the public is bombarded with facts, and those facts literally range from soup to nuts. Nobody can make sense of the numbers that get thrown around. Pick, for example, what percentage of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada are attributable to livestock. You've probably all seen the same fantastic range of numbers that I have. How do you make sense of that? It's another worldwide problem, and the world, mankind hasn't designed or developed our world to make worldwide decisions. So Nova Scotia produces next to nothing, but they want to do the right thing. Canada or the US says, well, China's the polluter, we'll follow them. China says, well, wait a minute, if we go first, we're going to lose money. So how do you make those decisions? I think this is a really nice, simple graphic message developed by Beef Cattle Research Council. It's good. And I think industry does have to have those simple, very credible, research-backed messages. But how do you get that to Joe or Jane consumer? They're not going to go to beefresearch.ca. So how do you get that message out there? Piranha Bulls. Does anybody know what a Piranha Bull is? Angela does. No? Have I not told you that story? Okay. So when I was with Ag Sites, we had a fellow from Brazil, Ricardo, and I was driving with him one day and we were talking about meetings, and he said, I think this group wants us to meet with that group, but I don't think we should because we don't want to be the Piranha Bull. And I had the same stunned expression. I'm kind of looking at it like, what? What are you talking about? So in Brazil, it's one of those business terms that comes from real life. In Brazil, they have large swaths of green grass, they have large herds of cattle, and they do kind of like mass scale rotational grazing, like take this big herd there and then take it there. They cross rivers. They come to some rivers that have piranha in them. So they stop the herd, get one old bull out, cut it so it's bleeding, and chase it into the river. And as that bull's being devoured, they get the herd safely across. So a piranha bull is somebody who delivers the tough message or does the hard thing, and they know they're going to get arrows in the back for doing it. So one example I could give would be a fellow by the name of Charlie Gracie, who in the mid-90s was involved with the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, and he said, guys, largely guys, we need to identify our cattle. And he got beat up. But he knew he was going to get beat up, but he also knew it was the right thing that needed to happen. My observation is that across just about every organization, including society, commodity organizations, everywhere, there's very little appetite for anybody to be that piranha bull and say, you know what, this stinks, but we need to do it and we're going to. I know you hate it, and I know you're going to talk bad about me and whatever, right? That is something that when you think of the context of a lot of the stuff I've talked about with how do we make decisions and who does this. Now the counter to that is you don't want somebody like some of our current strongman leaders being that piranha bull, because then they're making all kinds of really bad decisions. Those are my three things that I think will impact agriculture, livestock. So I'll just not bold predictions. There will be livestock in Ontario. That might sound, so what? But I remember 15 years ago, somebody in the ministry and I were talking, and I said, well, really, Christoph, the question is, does the Ontario government want livestock in Ontario? And I still think that's when you look at the land use and the water we have here, an argument could be made that we should move livestock out of here. Not a good one, but it could be made. There will be fewer farms. We will have more productive animals. I think plant-based protein will take a segment of the market, but I think there are some emerging things like, wait a minute, this is an ultra-processed food. How does that play into your decision to have healthy food? The world might segment. So I was talking to a person, I have not been to the Netherlands, but I was talking to a fellow with a company from the Netherlands, and we were talking about the impact of plant-based, and he said, oh, well, the minute we can have tofu that tastes and feels and like everything exactly like real meat, livestock's dead in the Netherlands. I don't know if he's right, but then he quickly added, that won't happen in North America because your resources and production systems are different. So for what that's worth, I'd never really thought about the fact that things could really split as far as where things happen and how they happen. I think cellular agriculture will move to a marketable product. I don't have a sense of how much of the market that could take. I think niche markets will be there. They'll grow somewhat, but they're going to stay niche markets. They have for decades. I think marketing systems will evolve. it's a pretty drastic comparison between non-supply managed and supply managed. I have no idea what they'll look like in 10 years, but I don't think they'll be, maybe, they'll both change, I think. I'm afraid that we will remain, for those that are not supply managed, too vulnerable, too dependent on a small number of export countries. I think the change will be driven by downstream players more so than at the beginning of the supply chain, and we're seeing that already. I think there will be genetically enhanced livestock products for sale. How we get there, I don't know. I don't know what they'll be, but I think it'll be there. It's there now. There's a salmon. If anybody knows, I'd love to know, but I have no idea what kind of market share it's getting. Data collection will be more automated. Some sectors will make good use of that data. I'm not convinced that all sectors in 10 years will be making good use of data the way they could be. There will be more regulations on farmers. I'm a bit of a cynic, but consumers will still say what they want, but then largely ignore it. I heard so many surveys that said consumers will pay 20% more for X. No, the consumer response versus market response they're two different things. I think farm animals will be generally healthier, but even just think of poultry populations and farming structures. I think there'll be far greater risk when something new does emerge, and it's going to fall. I think there'll be far more challenges and opportunities to the veterinarian world around diseases. And I'm not saying just because it's a poultry meeting, but obviously poultry is going to be a huge part of that. And somehow the farm community, and I mean the broad farm community, including OVC, OAC, the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture and Food, we've got to get better at holding and building that elusive trust around what we're doing. So just some thoughts, because more of my career is in the rearview mirror, more of yours is in the windshield. So my thoughts, or I hate to call it advice, but everybody here is a part of creating the future that will be Livestock 2030. So really get to know farms and farm organizations. Don't let there be gaps in between there. Cross-pollinate. When I came here, animal science grad, animal science and vets barely spoke. Like it was a joke, but it was a sad joke. For what I see, that has changed. I'd encourage now tie in even more engineering, political and social sciences, because a lot of what's going to play out is going to be driven by people and how they make decisions. I'd actually suggest that we need some really good people involved in politics. So if you've ever had a nugget of a thought that I think I'd be interested, don't just put that to the back of your brain. Actually think about it, because those are the people that, I mean, we kind of joke about politicians, but they do make important decisions. 360-degree research. I get really frustrated with this aspect says this, and then somebody counters, yeah, but this, and they're all tied together and nobody's painted the entire picture. I get really frustrated with that, particularly around climate change. Read books that aren't in your field. You may do that already. I've given you about 4 or 5 I would highly recommend. Travel, as part of your role here, you do tend to get to travel, which is awesome. Too many people don't do that. Really think through, if you're going to make a pitch, understand before you engage a person, what might they argue back and what are my counterpoints? And do that in advance, and then take it and make it simple. Always look for ways to collaborate, and I think it falls to all of us that when the time arises, you need to be comfortable to be that Piranha Bull and say, no, or we're going to make that decision. And with that, I'll stop, and hopefully I've created some thoughts.
Thank you for the excellent presentation, Mike. I believe we've got a few more minutes if anybody has any questions at all. I'm sure we do, because that was a lot.
Yeah.
Okay. The last slide you suggested make 360 degrees turn in your research. It's a fantastic idea, but we need funding for research. So if I'm changing my research, like 20%, 50% in the proposal, I'm not getting that grant. So how am I going to, or what are your suggestions, how to make this huge change
Yeah.
in research?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. It's easy to say do 360-degree research. I get it. That's really big, really expensive. How do you get that kind of money? Stephen, you and I were talking before, and you mentioned a fella who I had not heard of, but from UC Davis, who, and I'm not sure if he's actually doing the research. I guess when I say get involved in 360-degree research, it's not you're going to do it all, but try to get together teams that, and I know it's, I saw that body language. It's a lot more work because you have to work with a whole lot more people and maybe people you don't even agree with because they're bringing a completely different aspect. It's really easy for me to say, and I get it, it's really hard to do. If I was directing, I'm not, just to be clear, but if I was directing OMAFRA research funding, I'd start to put some real weight on, does this bring all the elements of this thing that we're looking at? Some of it, I mean, if it's, does this feed additive increase average daily gain? That's a very focused thing. But, and maybe Steve, can you mention that fellow's name? I don't remember it.
Frank Mittlerner, Prof. UC Davis.
Yeah. And he, from what you've told me, he tends to, and maybe it's be able to present 360 degrees, not actually do it yourself. Maybe I'm misstating my intention.
Any other questions for Mike?
Yeah.
What would be an emerging concern for plant-based protein in the future?
I'm sorry?
What would be the emerging concern?
Oh, emerging concern?
Yes, plant-based.
So what's the emerging concern for plant-based plant-based products? Recently, I saw. I just have to be careful what I can say because it had to do with where I saw it that I agreed I wouldn't say. But some concern around the fact that to get what is currently being sold as a plant-based meat replacement, it's basically an ultra-processed product. That's an angle that has not been presented to the public that, well, you don't, because there will be people who say, I don't want meat, but I'm going pure. I'm not going processed. Oh, wait a minute, this is ultra-processed? So there are those sorts of things.
Any final questions? Well, you've certainly given us a lot to think about. I know for one, I'll be doing a lot of the reading that you mentioned.
Good.
It's, yeah, a lot of times I don't start looking that far ahead in the future, but I know as an avid Leafs fan, you're always looking forward to the next.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Always next year.
With that, I think we'll wrap up the seminar for today. Thank you all for joining, and we'll have another one next month.
Thanks, Ryan.